Having a life scholarship and being able to afford to go to college made me feel inspired to go.
When I got a life scholarship, it was such a relief.
I knew that I wanted to have an impact. Having a life scholarship through the SC Education Lottery was huge. It gave me the opportunity to make that impact right here at home.
The South Carolina Education Lottery. A better you, a better us, a better South Carolina. Visit sceducationlottery.com/betteryou.
Bubba Wallace here from 2311 Racing. Funny thing about being fast, you end up waiting a lot. First to show up, first in line, then just waiting. Me, I rev up Chumba Casino. With over 200 social casino games, no slow lanes here. Why sit around when you can spin? I'm already racing. Your turn. Play for free at ChumbaCasino.com. Let's Chumba.
Sponsored by Chumba Casino. No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
Ready to make a real impact every day? Join the Active Day Home Care team and help clients maintain their independence in the comfort of their own homes. Make a difference in someone's life as you provide essential daily assistance and protect their health and happiness. Earn up to $20 an hour and enjoy additional perks like optional daily pay, 401k, paid time off, ongoing educational training, and more. Join a team that values care, compassion, and your professional growth. Visit activeday.com to apply.
All right, we are back and finally here. Closing arguments. You didn't even hear music before I started this one. There's a reason for that. We just ain't got no freaking time for that. We got to get into it. And before we get into the prosecution's closing arguments, I want to tell you what happened just prior to that. It's very important. Just prior to this, the prosecution dropped some what's known as RICO predicate acts. They dropped attempted kidnapping, attempted arson, kid cut his car, remember? Aiding and abetting sex trafficking, which I was surprised to see them drop, and extortion via NDAs or settlements. Now, the remaining RICO predicate acts are as follows: sex trafficking for Cassie and Jane, transportation for prostitution, that's what's known as Mann Act violations. I think they more than proved that. Drug distribution, facilitation of controlled substances, more than proved that in my opinion. Obstruction of justice, witness tampering, we'll have to wait and see. Bribery and coercion of employees. Now, this decision does not change the charges the office brought against Combs, but it does simplify the predicate acts that the jury should focus on when deliberating for a verdict. And remember, this is a complicated case. Not everybody can even grasp RICO at this point in the trial. So they're trying to make it easier for the prosecution by looking over what they feel like they didn't really prove and just saying we're dropping those charges. Now, keep in mind, the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organization Act, which is RICO, requires proof of at least 2 predicate acts or criminal offenses. The predicate acts must be related and they must demonstrate a pattern of criminal activity connected to an enterprise. So today, closing arguments for the prosecution, and I'm going to quote this word for word. And the reason that I'm going to do this is really twofold. Number one, I will be doing you a vast disservice by leaving something out. Look, Christy Slavik, who did this, what I'm going to call masterful closing argument, went fucking hard. She went hard. She didn't hold nothing back. I've been waiting for this the whole trial, and she saved it for the end. Let me tell you how important closing arguments are. In my opinion, this is what won the defense the O.J. Simpson trial. Look, I think O.J. Simpson was guilty, no doubt about it. But if you watch that closing argument that was given by Johnny Cochran, it is probably one of the best I've ever seen. It was just unbelievable. And I think until that point, OJ was in a bind. And I think when he delivered that closing argument, he was so relatable to the jury. And I mean, Cochran, they just liked the guy. It was hard to go against him. That's just my opinion. That being said, I think OJ was guilty as shit, but there you have it. We're going to get into it. Let's go. Let's do this. And Slavik starts. Over the last few weeks, you've learned that Sean Combs is the leader of a criminal organization. He doesn't take no for an answer. He's into kidnapping, arson, forced labor, bribery of a security officer, and the brutal crimes of sex trafficking. Consider two moments. March 2016 at the Intercontinental Hotel. The defendant got violent with Cassie. You saw what happened. He dragged her back to a freak-off. 2024 at Jane's house. The defendant choked and hit her. She ran, couldn't get away. These are chapters in the same book. The defendant counted on silence and shame. He thought that his fame and wealth and power put him above the law. Over the last 7 weeks, you've heard how he used his staff to promote his power. No one could stop him. We'll talk about RICO, including the sex trafficking and transportation for prostitution, which are separately charged as standalone crimes. You may have heard of racketeers. When someone commits a crime as part of a group, they are more dangerous. A group of people whose purpose was to serve and protect the defendant. It's his kingdom. Everyone was there to serve him, fulfilling all of his desires, including his sexual desires. We need to show at least 2 racketeering crimes. The defendant was the head of the Combs enterprise. This was an inner circle, his chief of staff and his bodyguards. The names changed, but the roles, they remain the same. You've heard about KK, Combs' right brain. She lived in 2-Star. She communicated with the defendant's girlfriends. His security, you've heard their names. D-Rock, Bonds, Rube, Uncle Paulie, Fahim. They were armed and ready. Remember the incident at the diner with Suge Knight? David James told you Combs had guns. In the search, law enforcement found guns, including a rifle with the serial numbers defaced, with their serial numbers cut out in the defendant's closet. You also have the rotating cast of assistants paid by the defendant's business. Brendan Paul said he made $100,000 a year. KK made 6 times that. When your boss asks you to buy drugs, you're committing a crime. When you kidnap someone or lock his girlfriend in a hotel room after your boss stomps out his face, it's a crime. The law does not require us to know that they liked committing these crimes. You saw KK chiding the defendant to not be so reckless, but she got him cash, she got him drugs, she was a member of the enterprise, and it impacted interstate commerce. Minimal is fine. Combs knowingly became a member. He was the boss. He was the through line. The racketeering acts, distribution of drugs, kidnapping, arson, bribery, facilitating sex trafficking of Cassie and Jane, forced labor, travel for commercial sex, cover up. You only need to find that someone would commit 2 acts in any of these categories. It could be 2 acts of drug distribution, 1 kidnapping, or 2. You have far more than 2. Let's start with the drugs, an essential ingredient in freak-offs. The most involved were D-Rock, KK, and Fahim, but others helped keep the drug supply high. We're not talking about marijuana, but what Brendan Paul called hard drugs. They are stipulations of the drugs found in the searches: cocaine, meth, oxy, ketamine, which is a dissociative drug. GHB, mushroom, Molly, Tusi, a combination of dyed pink. The quantities are not relevant. It's not an element in this crime. Distribution does not require a sale. You know the names of the drug dealers by now: Guido, One Stop, Baby Girl. Jane told you on 2 occasions she was told to bring drugs when she flew to meet him. She coordinated with KK. It's corroborated by text messages. KK told Jane to swing by to pick up Guido's package. He was called during hotel nights. So we know what the Guido package was: more ecstasy. The security team knew what it was. Guido even texted Fahim, quote, "Puff has a $450 balance with me." Brendan Paul asked for $780 for personal Gucci items. That's hard drugs. Drugs were distributed. It doesn't matter he wasn't buying kilos or selling them. Personal use is just a distraction. They bought and distributed these drugs to people around them. Cassie used drugs at every freak-off supplied by the defendant. He introduced Jane to drugs, gave them to her at all but one hotel night. He gave drugs to Carrie Morgan and Brianna. He made Brendan Paul try Tusi, just to see if it was good. We showed you the text from D-Rock to One Stop saying, "I need to see someone for brother," which he was referring to the defendant. Guido asked Fahim to cover the defendant's drug debt. KK knew he was distributing drugs to the woman for wild king nights. Jane told KK she was having a bad come down. KK gives professional tips on how to deal with that, plain and simple. This is drug distribution. How about kidnappings? They committed them under both California and New York law. Consider Cassie. Bond made her stay put. Remember? The defendant called Cassie a slut. He stomped on her face. She was disfigured. Roger Bonds caught her and brought her back. The defendant then was made to go to a London hotel on Sunset so no one saw her. She wanted to go home to her mom, but no, you can't. It's clear Cassie did not consent to staying in the London hotel. David James testified the defendant demanded to see his search history. If he had posted that the defendant assaulted Cassie in the club, it's clear Cassie did not consent to staying in the London hotel. David James testified the defendant demanded to see her search history. If he had posted that the defendant assaulted Cassie in the club, what do you think would have happened? Then there's Capricorn Clark. They made her take a lie detector test for days in an empty office building in Manhattan, and this was in 2004. She was holding expensive jewelry that went missing. Uncle Paulie took her to the future headquarters of Bad Boy, and she was tested for 5 days. The man administering the test said if she failed, she'd end up in the East River in Central Park. The defendant told her if anything happened, he'd have to kill her. David James remembers this. He was tested too, and he was told it was to get a rat out of the team. In December of 2011, Capricorn Clark was kidnapped. The defendant banged on Capricorn's door with a gun. He was out for revenge. He barked an order at Capricorn. Get dressed. We're going to kill Cuddy. They then drive to Kid Cudi's house. The defendant had a gun in his lap. There was kidnapping. He moved her a substantial distance. She didn't want to go. The defendant said he wouldn't let her go until she told him where Cassie was, who he kicked when he arrived and found her into a fetal position. Now, Cassie was with Kid Cudi that morning. She testified to this.
Bubba Wallace here from 2311 Racing. Funny thing about being fast, you end up waiting a lot. First to show up, first in line, then just waiting. Me, I rev up Chumba Casino. With over 200 social casino games, no slow lanes here. Why sit around when you can spin? I'm already racing. Your turn. Play for free at ChumbaCasino.com. Let's Chumba.
Sponsored by Chumba Casino. No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
Lowe's knows that no matter your paint project, saving is at the top of your list. That's why when you shop today, you can buy one, get one free select Valspar and HGTV Home by Sherwin-Williams one-coat coverage interior paints via rebate. Shop these deals in-store or online today at Lowe's. We help, you save. Rebate in form of Visa gift card equal to 100% off the second eligible item purchased before or after applicable discounts, if any. See details. Offer ends 7/9.
And the officer who responded to the 911 call, he said he saw a black Escalade registered to Bad Boy Entertainment. Then, on January 12th of 2012, the defendant had Kid Cudi's car set on fire. Someone cut a hole in the roof of his car and dropped a Molotov cocktail in it. We're not suggesting the defendant cut the hole, but he didn't even buy his own soup. What makes you think he would do that? Even in his voice notes, he threatened he was going to blow up Kid Cudi's car. What are the odds that he says something like that and it happens? Then there's bribery. Remember that 2016 video? The defendant was having a freak off with Cassie and one of the escort's jewels. Flores found the defendant sitting in a chair with what he called a devilish stare. And in the room, he saw another man. The defendant tried to hand Flores a stack of money. This was his first attempt at bribe that day. As Cassie leaves, Combs starts damage control. He calls Cassie over a dozen times, then texts, "Call me, the cops are here." Now, he was just manipulating her, but the defendant knew he could be arrested. There was video of the assault. He knew that. He went and banged on Cassie's door with a hammer. Neighbors, they were going to call the police. As it went on, KK called and reached Eddie Garcia. Eddie said no, then KK shows up in person and he won't show her, but says off the record, it's bad regarding the video. KK had the defendant call Eddie on his personal cell phone, and once Eddie said his boss will do it for $50,000, the defendant calls him Eddie, my angel. That's how he saved the guy in his cell phone. Eddie, my angel. Eddie goes to deliver the USB, and D-Rock and KK are there. The defendant counted out dollar by dollar the bribe. Eddie's asked to sign a NDA and not speak to anyone. He was paying for silence. Now, the next racketeering predicate is sex trafficking. The defendant's inner circle assisted, whether they wanted to or not, threats, drugs, lies, and illegal violence to make them have sex with escorts. This is not an attempt to criminalize dysfunctional relationships or personal sexual behavior. They did not want to have sex with strangers while the defendant masturbated. They were covered in oil, sore, and had sex over and over again. We're not asking you to find that every hotel night or freak off was sex trafficking, or even the majority. You only need to know the elements were met one time, one freak off. That's it. He's guilty. But we all know it was way more than once. Let's start with the love bombing stage. Jane, she was head over heels. Love bombing is a tactic. He was grooming her. Then he gives her ecstasy, and she falls to the ground convulsing. The defendant liked baby oil and red lights. And then in 2021, she gets introduced to the freak off. She wanted to please her partner. She was high. The defendant had a freak off set up that very night. An escort came by, and Jane was excited by that first experience. She didn't realize she had opened a Pandora's box. It became 90% of their relationship. And for a while, she went along. Then she told him she wanted to stop, and there were texts about this. Remember, Jane wrote, "I wanted to do things outside these rooms, to travel with you." And the defendant, he ignored Jane's discomfort. Those hotel nights were not about what Jane wanted to do. They were about what the defendant wanted to see. And he decided how long. Jane said if she was going to have sex with strange men, she should choose which ones. The defendant made her ask them for nude photos. These were not for her. When she asked to use condoms, remember? The defendant was not happy. He was dismissive and condescending. She would try to have it go faster, and he'd order her to slow down. It was always about what he wanted. He would dangle carrots. He'd give her gifts and money. He lied to her repeatedly. She asked, "When are we going to do a getaway?" And he'd say they'd go on a yacht, but they never did. Here's what Jane wrote in her notes apps. Quote, "I don't want to have you use me to fulfill your freaky, wild desires in hotel rooms." What does that tell you? Now, he used his payment of her rent as leverage. The carrot turned into a stick, and the threats and innuendo were nonstop. He paid for her veneers because he didn't like her teeth, then said, "Look at the roof over her head and your pretty mouth and teeth." He wanted the all-star party, sex with 3 men, and she had to send him a photo of her period blood to dissuade him. He then sent this voice note. "I'm about to really disappear on you. I don't have no time for this, baby girl. You got me on my job. You got to get on your job." Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, this message couldn't be clearer. He was not going to take no for an answer. And Jane told you after reading Cassie's lawsuit, she wrote the defendant, quote, "I feel like I'm reading my own sexual trauma. 2 of my birthdays, you forced me into sex with strangers. You gaslit me. It was sexual exploitation you framed as your love for your sick fetishes." The defendant called her and tried to trick her into saying it was all consented to. He fed her a false narrative. Remember, the doctor that testified told you how a victim is trauma bonded to her abuser. Jane often felt the defendant didn't listen to the truth. She said Sean would just move on. He told her to charge him. The lawyers would be involved. And he did all of this to buy her silence. So she asked for $100,000 a year for her to move on. She thought it was reasonable, far less than Cassie. And the defendant went ballistic. Jane wrote the defendant was going to show her sex tapes to the father of her child. Then he reached out and told her to come see him in Miami. She makes it clear she'll go to Miami, but she doesn't want a hotel night, and he agrees. Yet, despite his promise, he still calls an escort. Now, all of this culminated with Jane in June of 2024. If you'll remember, she testified that he assaulted her and forced her to perform oral sex on an escort. Men and women in the jury, this is sex trafficking. It was interstate, and the Astroglide even crossed state lines. The defendant knew, or at least recklessly disregarded that. In 2023, he made Jane feel she'd have a proper New York City weekend.
Hello, it is Ryan, and I was on a flight the other day playing one of my favorite social spin slot games on ChumbaCasino.com. I looked over at the person sitting next to me, and you know what they were doing? They were also playing Chumba Casino. Everybody's loving having fun with it. Chumba Casino is home to hundreds of casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere. So sign up now at ChumbaCasino.com to claim your free welcome bonus. That's ChumbaCasino.com and live the Chumba life.
Sponsored by Chumba Casino.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
But he invited escorts. Jane sent him another message, quote, "It's dark and sleazy, and I'm in fear of losing my home." His response, "Girl, stop." At the same time he was texting her as she was flying to him in New York City, he was texting Paul, another escort. You saw the messages. When she's in the air, he tells her he has a surprise for her. She didn't want that surprise. Before the plane even lands, the act of sex trafficking is completed. He tricked her. Then, under coercion, she calls an escort to come to New York. In the next text, she says, "I'm in New York City. I knew you'd pair me up with some random person. And remember that sobriety party without drugs?" She is so disgusted, she vomits. She wrote Sean, "I'm not a porn star. I'm not an animal. I need a break." And the defendant responds, "Let's spend the day, no strangers." And she replied, "You'll love bomb me." And that's when he switches from that carrot to that stick, folks. Remember, he texts, "Are you going to let me into our house?" He texted this 8 times. Then he said he was sick and he needed her. She goes to him even then. And what does he do? Eventually, she ends up having sex without drugs with 3 different men. In 2024, at her house, 3 months after the agents searched the defendant's homes, which incidentally is why they used Jane's house. He goes there and they were supposed to have a fun date night. They drank, then they argued, then she pushed his head into the counter. He shouts at her. She tells him to leave. She runs and closes doors. He kicked down 3 doors. You saw the pictures of the doors. She ran without shoes. She hid. He was looking for her. She hit the defendant. He punches her in the face. And you saw those pictures. He drags her by the hair back into the house. And Jane took his phone and called the woman that she was convinced Sean Combs was with. And at the same time, the defendant calls Jonathan Perez. He followed her into the shower. He hit her, knocked her down. Even after all of this, he calls Anton the escort. She has to put on makeup to hide her injuries, meets Anton at the gate, and when she walks back in, he tells her, quote, "Take this fucking pill." And that's when Sean Combs puts his face inches from her and asked her, "Is this coercion?" Jane performed oral sex on Anton until he ejaculated. The defendant told the security to bring cash to Anton. They didn't have it. The next day, he gave Jane the money to pay Anton. She Ubered the bag of money over to Anton. This is proof of coercion. I want to go back to talking about the larger relationship between the defendant and Jane because, as I mentioned, the 3 incidents, they prove count 4, but they didn't happen in isolation, and they involve many aspects of that relationship between the defendant and Jane. Starting first with the defendant paying rent for Jane's house. Now, we've already talked about this, but this is just an example of the defendant's financial coercion of Jane. As you remember from Jane's testimony after the defendant started paying her rent, this was in April of 2023, she felt completely obligated to continue these hotel nights. This is, as I said, an example of the defendant's financial coercion of Jane. His threats to withhold her rent are examples of threats of non-physical harm that compelled Jane to perform in these hotel nights. So I'm not going to go over the examples that we just looked at, but you've heard her testimony. You've read her text messages, some of which we read today. The defendant's threats to stop paying her rent made her feel obligated to do whatever he wanted her to do. Another important part of the pattern of the defendant's coercion was drugs. Before meeting with the defendant, Jane only used drugs a handful of times, but they became a necessary part of her life with the defendant because they made it easier for her to get through these hotel nights. You see in the testimony, she says that she feels like she had to take them. It made it easier. It made those hotel nights not feel real. The defendant gave her ecstasy and Molly that made her feel aroused and willing to try new things and to make her agree with these hotel nights. Because if she was high on drugs that made her feel aroused, she wouldn't refuse. The drugs were just another way the defendant made sure that he got Jane to say yes, to ensure that she wouldn't say no. Now, you've heard about the effects of these drugs. Jane told you about a hotel night that took place in July of 2024. That was after the violent hotel night in June of 2024. The defendant had gotten her back after an incident of violence with more love bombing. And in Miami in July of 2024, the defendant gave Jane a new sort of drug. Liquid Molly, she called it. And that drug gave her a super intense high. Unlike anything she had ever experienced, the defense showed you clips of movies from that hotel night. And I expect that they'll argue that those videos you watched earlier in the week, those videos showed Jane was into it. But what do those videos really show you? What they really show is that she was super high, just like she told you. She was different in those videos, different than the other videos that you've seen. And that's because she was high on a different drug during those videos. The defendant's coercion of Jane also involved other serious threats, including threats to release tapes of her having sex with escorts in hotel rooms when she didn't behave the way the defendant wanted her to. Again, here's Jane's text to KK telling KK that the defendant had threatened to release her sex tapes, where she's heavily drugged, and just doing the things he was asking her to do, things that she's still trying to recover from. And then they showed those texts. Now, at this point, you have seen multiple videos of hotel nights. They're some of the most private, intimate, embarrassing moments of Jane's life. The defendant knows how powerful they are as leverage. So the defendant, who had a library of videos and photos of Jane from those hotel nights, he threatened to expose her and send the sex tapes to her child's father. This threat is another effort to control Jane. Another effort to coerce her. All of these factors in combination show the defendant's course of conduct that's meant to control, manipulate, and coerce Jane into engaging in sex acts. These factors lurking in the background of their relationship meant that Jane couldn't say no to hotel nights without risking the rent payments, without risking violent outbursts, without risking the release of her sex tape. The defense has suggested several times that Jane agreed to these hotel nights, both in their opening statement and in cross-examination of Jane. But let's talk about what agreeing means in the context of coercion. At this point, you know what coercion is. It's threatening physical or non-physical harm, which of course includes reputation, and financial harm. To compel someone to perform a commercial sex act to avoid incurring that harm. In other words, coercion means getting someone to agree to a commercial sex act because they're afraid of the consequences if they disagree. So when the defense is suggesting that Jane agree to hotel nights, it's really an incomplete picture. You have to look at the full relationship. You have to look at the defendant love bombing her, lashing out at her, providing her with drugs, paying her rent, and then threatening to stop paying her rent, making false promises to her, threatening to release her sex tape. This is not an adult woman making a free choice, as the defense has suggested. It's a woman who told the defendant that she didn't want to do the hotel nights, but has relented to avoid any number of bad things happening to her. So let's turn to Cassie, because before Jane, there was Cassie, and we already talked about some of the defendant's criminal acts involving Cassie. But now we're going to turn to the defendant's trafficking of Cassie that's charged in count 2 and also part of the racketeering conspiracy. You've heard the elements already, and just like with Jane, there's really no dispute as to the first or third elements of sex trafficking. Just like with Jane, the defendant recruited and enticed Cassie into participating in freak-offs. He transported her across the country and internationally for the same reason. The defendant also maintained and harbored Cassie at residences he paid for and at hotels where freak-offs were held. And there's also no serious dispute the freak-offs affected interstate commerce, just like he did with Jane. The defendant flew Cassie and male escorts across the country to New York, LA, Miami, and other countries like Turks, Spain for freak-offs. You've seen the communications exchanged between Cassie and others about setting up the freak-offs. Those included interstate calls and messages, and there were other goods that were moved as far as interstate commerce regarding the freak-offs. That's a lubricant, baby oil, condoms, and alcohol. And finally, Cassie told you that she never did a freak-off without drugs. And if there are drugs, there's an effect on interstate commerce. That means the issue in dispute is whether the defendant knew or disregarded that force, fraud, coercion, or any combination of those needs would be used to cause Cassie to engage in freak-offs. Now remember that you don't have to find that all of these things were used. It can be any one of these illegal means by itself, or it could be any combination of those illegal means. Just like with Jane, we're going to talk through a few specific incidents here. It's crystal clear that all the elements of sex trafficking are met. First, we'll talk about the freak-off at the Intercontinental Hotel in 2016. Then we'll talk about the freak-off at Cassie's Manhattan apartment with an escort named Daniel Phillip around 2013. And finally, we'll talk about a freak-off in 2012 after the Cannes Film Festival. We're going to talk about all of these examples in just a few minutes. But you know from sitting through this trial that force and coercion that the defendant used against Cassie was not limited to a couple of days.
It is Ryan Seacrest here. There was a recent social media trend which consisted of flying on a plane with no music, no movies, no entertainment. But a better trend would be going to ChumbaCasino.com. It's like having a mini social casino in your pocket. Chumba Casino has over 100 online casino-style games, all absolutely free. It's the most fun you can have online and on a plane. So grab your free welcome bonus now at ChumbaCasino.com. Sponsored by Chumba Casino.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
We have to zoom out and look at her decade-long relationship with the defendant. And I'm going to do this in 4 parts. The defendant and Cassie, then we'll talk about the abuse, then we'll move into the end of their relationship, and then we're going to talk about the freak-offs. We'll talk about the freak-offs last, but just keep in mind, they were going on throughout the entire relationship, from beginning to end. Throughout all of the abuse that we're going to be talking about, freak-offs were taking place. And as we talk about these aspects of their relationship, keep in mind the elements of sex trafficking. In particular, remember what I said about coercion. It can be proved if the defendant engaged in a scheme, plan, or pattern intended to cause the victim to believe that if she didn't engage in the commercial sex act, she would suffer serious harm. Cassie and Sean were in a relationship for about a decade. They had what you would call an intense bond. But as you heard many witnesses talk about, their relationship was not what you would consider normal. Throughout that decade that they were together, Sean Combs regularly threatened and he beat Cassie. He plied her with drugs. And at some point, she became reliant on drugs. And while she was on drugs, the defendant forced and coerced her to perform sex with escorts in front of him. Like with Jane, it became her job. It became her shame. When Cassie met the defendant, she was an unknown 19-year-old aspiring singer. He was a 37-year-old established record executive at the top of his game. The defendant signed Cassie to a 10-album deal with his record label, Bad Boy. And Cassie put out her first album in August of 2006. Not long after he signed Cassie, the defendant made it clear that he wanted more. They started spending time together, and the relationship became sex. On a weekend getaway to Miami, the defendant took Cassie on a yacht, gives her ecstasy for the first time, and the drug made Cassie feel euphoric and sexual. During that trip, Cassie and the defendant had sex for the first time. And after that trip, Cassie and the defendant, they were in a relationship. Cassie told you about this. She said she couldn't say naive enough to describe herself at that time. She had just turned 21. The defendant was her boss. He was a person who called the shots. He chose what was next for Cassie's career. A man almost 20 years older than her. She described him as larger than life. He was worldly. He introduced her to drugs, and he taught her different ways to have sex. The age difference, the power inequality, Cassie's naivete, those dynamics drove the defendant's relationship with Cassie, and that was intentional. Remember David James, the defendant's former assistant? He overheard the defendant describe his relationship with Cassie to a colleague. The defendant said that he had Cassie right where he wanted her. She was young and impressionable. He remembered the defendant saying she was very moldable, and that's exactly what the defendant did. He molded her. Capricorn told a story that really illustrates this. The defendant told Capricorn, "Let me show you something." And he called Cassie into the room. When Cassie got there, the defendant told her to sit down, stand up, turn around, turn the other way, walk over there, grab that, hand me that, walk back, turn around, go back to the other room. And Cassie did exactly what he told her to do. And that's exactly what he wanted her to do. Total compliance. You've heard it many times by now. The defendant didn't take no for an answer. And with Cassie, he thought he'd found someone who wouldn't even try. The defendant's efforts to control Cassie defined their relationship. He was abusive, physical, emotional, psychological, and sex abuse. The defendant doesn't try to deny the abuse. They just want you to call it domestic violence and to believe it has nothing to do with the crimes charged here. But that misses the point. Just like the abuse lasted for the whole relationship, the defendant was having freak-offs with Cassie during the whole relationship. The freak-offs happened before, after, and during the relationship. Sometimes during the defendant's violent episodes. They were intertwined. The cloud of the defendant's abuse was hanging over Cassie's head, always hovering. Cassie described the defendant's control over her life as an all-around thing. From where she lived, to what she looked like, to what she worked on, to who she spoke to. Here in the testimony, she said control was everything from the way I looked to what I was working on that day, to who I was speaking to. It was an all-around thing. The defendant controlled how Cassie looked. He demanded that her nails be done a certain way and that her hair was done a certain way. Multiple witnesses told you how the defendant had the final say on Cassie's clothes and even her look for music videos, red carpets, and modeling shoots. The Vanity Fair party in 2014 that Deontay Nash told you about, that's just one example. In that story, the defendant grabbed Deontay by his jacket, lifted him up, and shouted, "I thought I told y'all that she needed to wear her hair up." Cassie's career was no different. The defendant was in control. He kept her occupied with busy work, spending hours and hours in the studio, recording songs that no one would listen to. The defendant would check in constantly, calling or texting until he reached Cassie, and sending staff to find her if he could not. But Even though she recorded hundreds of songs, the defendant never let her release another album. She was allowed to put out a mixtape in 2013, but at the defendant's insistence, it was free. Despite her 10-album deal, the defendant wasn't allowed to make money from her music. She tried to make money in other ways, through club postings or modeling, but the defendant often wouldn't let her take those opportunities either. In one conversation, she offered the opportunity to do a video. She can't do it because Puffy said no to the video. The defendant made it so that it didn't matter if Cassie was earning money through her music or not. He paid for her cars, clothing, phone, vacations. He made her dependent on him. And when he wanted to, he took those things away. Or he had security take it away, do it for him. Cassie said that happened all the time. And here is one message recounting one such incident. After the defendant accused her of dancing with someone else, he takes her phone. Then he took her laptops. Then he took her car and everything. And he did it to her family too. After the defendant found out Cassie was seeing Kid Cudi in December of 2011, he demanded Cassie's parents pay him $20,000 that he had given Cassie earlier in the month, or else he'd release sex tapes. You heard the testimony of Regina Ventura, Cassie's mother. You heard her testify about that, and you saw in the bank records, Cassie's parents had to take out a home equity line to pay the defendant. That's the $20,000 transaction that you saw. Meanwhile, in the defendant's bank account that month, $3.4 million was deposited, and $3.2 million went out of it. That's the line at the top. The credits and debits. And this was just one of the defendant's bank accounts. He had several, as you heard. This wasn't about $20,000. This was about control. The defendant also paid for Cassie's homes and showed up unannounced. She never knew when it would happen, and it left her stomach in knots. And it's no wonder why. Look at the text message between D-Rock and Cassie. She told D-Rock the defendant had kicked down 3 of her doors. She told D-Rock, he has my key, so I'm leaving. I don't feel safe. 3 of my doors are broken. Cassie asked D-Rock to take her house key from the defendant, and D-Rock's response, you know I can't take your keys from him. Cassie never knew what to expect or who the defendant would be when he woke up that day. Some days, he was explosive and violent. This kept Cassie on uncertain footing and let her feel trapped. Now remember what Dr. Hughes said about this. When a victim is on unstable footing, they don't know how and when the abuser is going to abuse them. They feel more trapped and they can't get out of the dynamic. But that's what the defendant wanted, and it gave him control. Within the first year of their relationship, the defendant started physically abusing Cassie. He punched her, kicked her, dragged her. He left her with black eyes, bruises, busted lips. When it was bad, the defendant hid her away in hotels until she healed up enough that the injuries weren't noticeable. Like the incident that we talked about earlier when the defendant stomped on her face and you didn't just hear about the abuse from Cassie. Remember, you saw text messages, photos, videos, and multiple witnesses in this trial saw it firsthand and spoke about it. It wasn't a secret to anyone who was around the defendant and Cassie regular. People like D-Rock, Fahim, Holly, they all saw that. They all saw the injuries. We don't have time to talk about all those violent incidents now. There are way too many. Now remember, the whole time the defendant was physically abusing Cassie, they were also having freak-offs. That's why this is important. In 2007 and 2008, the defendant hit Cassie after a dinner in New York City. He hit her in the side of the head, causing her to fall to the floor of a car. She was shocked. She didn't understand what made him so angry. In 2010, the defendant attacked Cassie twice after she went to a party at Prince's house without checking in with him and chased her out of the party and attacked her until Prince's personal security intervened. Then at the hotel where Cassie was staying, she was attacked again and ended up with a swollen eye, busted lip, and knots on her head. Mia told you about this incident. In 2011, the defendant attacked Cassie after finding out that she was seeing Kid Cudi. We talked about this. Cassie also told you about this. When she got to the house and went to talk to the defendant, he was irate. He threatened to release sex tapes, the tapes of her doing freak-offs. He said he was going to hurt her and Kid Cudi. We saw the messages, and then when she tried to leave, he kicked her, knocked her to the ground. Capricorn told you about that too. And her mom took a photo of the bruises after that incident. In 2013, the defendant attacked Cassie in her apartment when she was with Mia and Deontay.
Step into the world of power, loyalty, and luck.
I'm gonna make him an offer he can't refuse.
With family, cannolis, and spins mean everything.
Now, you wanna get mixed up in the family business.
Introducing The Godfather at ChumbaCasino.com. Test your luck in the shadowy world of The Godfather slot.
Someday, I will call upon you to do a service for me.
Play The Godfather now at ChumbaCasino.com.
Welcome to the family.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
Cassie, Mia, and Deontay all told you about this. Cassie was sleeping. The defendant burst in. He was yelling. He threw her down. Her head smashed against the bed frame in her bedroom. That resulted in an eyebrow cut. Mia and Deontay tried to stop him, but he threw them off, and he hurt them too. Afterward, the defendant had D-Rock take Cassie to a plastic surgeon in Beverly Hills to sew her up. Around that same time, the defendant assaulted Cassie in Jamaica on vacation, giving her yet another black eye. You can see it in the photo on the right. The reason? Cassie was taking too long in the bathroom. Carrie Morgan described what happened. She saw the defendant drag Cassie down the hallway by her hair while Cassie was screaming. Carrie described the sound of Cassie's screams as terrifying. They got outside and Carrie saw the defendant push Cassie to the ground, causing her to hit her head on a brick and knocking herself out cold. In 2015 in Las Vegas, the defendant beat up Cassie during a party he was throwing at his hotel. The defendant punched and kicked Cassie, who was curled up underneath the bathroom toilet. Remember, she told you that when D-Rock saw her, he started to cry. She told you about the injuries, the black eyes, the golf ball-sized knot, the busted lip. Finally, there was the defendant's shocking assault on Cassie during a freak-off at that hotel that was caught on tape. We're going to talk more about that later. Any one of these attacks would have been terrifying, life-changing, but for Cassie, it became her normal. And because the defendant's violence was so unpredictable, so random, it was even more destabilizing. As Cassie told you, make the wrong face. The next thing you know, you were getting hit in the face. And in case all of this violence wasn't enough, Cassie also saw and was told about the defendant attacking her friends. She was there when he attacked Mia, when he attacked Deontay. She was at her apartment when the defendant attacked Brianna on her balcony. Brianna may have gotten that day wrong, but you know the attack happened. Cassie texted about it. She texted KK about it in 2016. You saw the screenshot where Cassie described the incident, and you saw the metadata showing you that KK took the screenshot in September of 2016, and Cassie was there when the defendant attacked Carrie Morgan by throwing a wooden hanger. Both Carrie and Brianna were seriously hurt. Carrie had a concussion and was vomiting, and Brianna had injuries to her neck and legs. Cassie also knew that the defendant had access to guns. She had seen them at his home. One time, he had made her carry a gun in her purse into a club. She described the defendant using guns as a scare tactic. And remember that incident at Mel's Diner that we talked about this morning? Cassie was at the house that night. She saw the defendant and D-Rock put on black clothes, cover their heads, grab guns from the safe, and go confront Suge Knight. The defense has asked during this trial why. If the violence was so bad, if Cassie was so unhappy, why didn't she leave? But you know why. Dr. Hughes explained that when you're beat up or hit, the normal human emotion that arises is fear, and it's very hard to take that away once you've been hit. The victim starts walking on eggshells, trying not to do something to get hit. Their resources are devoted on how to stay safe, not how to figure out how to get things in order and leave. And of course, there were times Cassie tried to leave, but what happened when Cassie tried to run or leave? The defendant was violent with her. The defendant or members of his inner circle went after her and brought her back. You heard many examples of this too. The examples that we talked about earlier this morning when Cassie tried to run away from the car after the defendant stomped her face. Remember, it was Roger Bonds who went after her and brought her back. Carrie Morgan and Cassie ran away from the defendant multiple times. One time, after the defendant pushed, hit, and kicked Cassie, Carrie begged security to intervene, and security refused. Instead, Cassie and Carrie ran away. and security helped the defendant look for them. Even when Cassie was a world away from the defendant in South Africa and had blocked the defendant from calling her, she couldn't get away. KK, the defendant's right hand, a member of his enterprise, did the defendant's bidding and pulled her back into the defendant's orbit. Same thing that happened to D-Rock. Cassie thought that he was her friend, but he wasn't. D-Rock was only loyal to the defendant. So after the Intercontinental incident in March of 2016, D-Rock helped the defendant keep tabs on Cassie. But months before that, in a text exchange, D-Rock was doing the same thing. D-Rock said, Kaz was calling up the studio looking for you. The defendant said, it's time for the ice. What's Cassie doing? What's he saying here? D-Rock's responsible for making sure that Cassie is icing those injuries from the defendant from a most recent attack. D-Rock said, I don't know what's going on. I was just checking on her. This is D-Rock playing both sides. He's telling Cassie one thing. He's acting like he's her friend, but he's reporting back to the defendant every single step. Now, at the end of the summer, Cassie and the defendant, they meet up for dinner in Malibu, and they had a nice dinner. Things seemed good. Then, when the defendant brought Cassie back to her house, he comes inside and rapes her on the living room floor. Cassie told you his eyes went black. She said no. She cried. But he didn't take no for an answer. He didn't stop. Like Jane, Cassie went back after the violence because of that trauma bond. Even after he raped her, she didn't hate him. She said she saw him at a friend's birthday party and went to his house, and after that, they had sex consensually. Like she told you, they were still very connected. So let's talk now about the freak-offs, the commercial acts underlying count number 2. Remember, these did not occur in isolation. The defendant wanted them all the time. These were as regular as his abuse of Cassie. And just like the abuse, the freak-offs started early in the relationship. Freak-offs weren't something the defendant and Cassie came up with together. The defendant had set a playbook. He'd book a hotel room, hire an escort, set up the lights, drinks, towels, sheets, and direct Cassie through an orchestrated event. That sounds just like the hotel nights that Jane endured. Like Jane, Cassie agreed to the first freak-off, but pretty quickly realized this wasn't something she wanted to be doing. Now, this shouldn't be a surprise. Think about how she described them. Hours and hours long, covered in baby oil, wearing uncomfortable outfits, sometimes when Cassie had her period, sometimes when she had UTIs, sometimes when the defendant told the escorts to urinate on her, and sometimes he did it too. Why? Because it turned him on and was humiliating for her. But she kept doing them for 10 years, and drugs were a big part of that reason. The defendant gave Cassie drugs at every freak-off. She took them and she performed, not just at freak-offs. Eventually, she became addicted and started using drugs on her own after never taking drugs before she got hooked up with Sean Combs. She ended up with a severe addiction. Drugs weren't all of it, to be sure. Cassie also told you she did freak-offs because she was in love with the defendant and wanted to make him happy. You've seen plenty of exhibits showing Cassie told you that herself. She also told you over the course of the relationship with the defendant, there were hundreds of freak-offs. And even if Cassie didn't want to do a freak-off, there were times she went along with it anyway. You've seen messages where she writes, I love our freak-offs when we both want it. And I want to be clear here. We're not asking you to find that every freak-off was an instance of sex trafficking. That is not an all-or-nothing situation. But there were many freak-offs that Cassie participated in because of the defendant's force, threat of force, or coercion, and where the defendant knew that Cassie was only participating in those freak-offs because of his force, threats, or coercion. That conduct is illegal. That conduct is sex trafficking. And of course, the defendant knew exactly what he was doing because Cassie obviously didn't want to be having sex with strangers for days. She obviously didn't want to have a painful uterus. She obviously didn't want an escort to urinate in her mouth while she laid on the floor. And the defendant was so sure that Cassie didn't want to do the freak-offs that he held sex tapes over her head as collateral. He used them as a way to coerce her into doing the freak offs. You saw that in emails that we showed you. Now, before we get into some of the specific examples of sex trafficking with Cassie, let's stop for a moment and talk about the videos themselves. You've seen clips of them, and some of them you've seen they were entered into evidence, and you don't see weapons. You don't see the defendant hitting Cassie. Of course, if he videoed something like that, he probably wouldn't hold on to it. You know about how much work he did to get rid of the Intercontinental Hotel video. She's following the defendant's directions, just like Jane did in Jane's video. She's performing, just like Jane. Don't be fooled into thinking that it's anything more than just a performance. If you look closely, you'll see everything Cassie told you about freak-offs is true. They're orchestrated, they're directed. The defendant is moving the camera around himself at times, focused on the escort and not Cassie at all. And that's very similar to the videos we showed you of Jane. It's clear this was his fantasy, not Cassie's. Like with Jane, there are a few specific examples where the evidence is clear that the defendant caused Cassie to have sex with an escort by force, threats of force, coercion, or a combination of those things. Based on any of those incidents alone, the defendant is guilty of count 2. So let's walk through those examples, and we'll start with that Intercontinental Hotel video. You've seen a lot of evidence about this incident. Multiple witnesses testified about it. You saw text messages, reports, photos, and of course the video, because there's a lot to cover on this topic. I'm going to break it down into 3 parts: before the freak off, during the freak off, and when Cassie tries to leave in the middle of a freak off. So before this freak off, Cassie was preparing for her first movie premiere. This was incredibly important in her life. So when the defendant texted Cassie 2 days before the premiere, "What you gonna do so I can plan the rest of my night?" Cassie understood the defendant was looking to have a freak off, and she decided to play ball. She was worried that the defendant would ruin her big night, and she thought if she gave him what he wanted, a freak off, then maybe he wouldn't ruin it for her. She said she was doing damage control. You saw the text. Cassie said, "Baby, I want to freak off so bad." And he wants her to call Garen, who was the owner of Cowboys for Angels, that escort service. He tells her this 4 times. He's determined. They end up bringing Jules to the hotel, one of the defendant's regular escorts. And that brings us to the during aspect of the freak off. Now, there is a gap in the text and the phone records, and that's when you know, jury, that the freak off is happening. Jules, the defendant, and Cassie are at the hotel, and you know what happens? An argument starts. The defendant hits Cassie in the face. All she can think about is her premiere, so she decides to get out of there before the defendant can mess up her face even more. Cassie takes off so fast she doesn't even have time to put her shoes on. The defendant chases after Cassie. As you can see, he didn't have time to get dressed. He's naked in a towel except for socks. He attacks her. He throws her to the ground. He kicks her repeatedly. She doesn't fight back. And then the defendant tries to drag her back to the room where Jules is waiting. Now, why is it relevant that the defendant is trying to drag her back into the room? Because Jules is there. Remember, there's a freak off taking place. Freak offs have multiple sessions. And remember, Cassie said at this particular freak off, they were between sessions. And the defendant's not going to let her go. The freak off is not over. As she wiggles away from his grip, the defendant makes a decision. He leaves her, but he takes her bags. He knows that she can't leave without her things, but as he walks down the hallway, he looks back. He was expecting her to follow him. He's surprised that she's not. The defendant is making a conscious decision at this time. He goes back to Cassie. He tries to get her back into the room, but Cassie won't do it. Instead, she's using the phone in the elevator lobby. The defendant's making another conscious decision here. He decides to bring the bags back to the room and come back for Cassie with his hands free. So when he comes back for her a third time, he makes yet another decision. He grabs Cassie's phone out of her hands. He knows she can't leave without her phone. But now that Cassie is called for security, the defendant has another decision. Does he drag her back to the room? If he does that, Security could see him dragging her down the hallway, and they could call the cops, or they could come up to the room and they could see Jules. But if he leaves Cassie in the lobby, then there's no chance that Cassie will go back to the room and finish the freak off. And if he leaves Cassie alone, he can't control what she is going to say to security. He knows she won't do anything if he's there. So he makes a decision to stay. Even though he's in a towel and looks ridiculous, he makes the decision to stay there with Cassie. He's mad that she fucked up the freak off, so he throws the vase at her. But as soon as Israel Flores shows up, the defendant switches into damage control mode. He stays calm. He speaks to Officer Flores. Looks like he's even making Officer Flores laugh. He tells Cassie that she can't leave, and he stalls in the hallway. He knows Jules still in the room, probably naked, so he continues to stall in that hallway. He's in total control of himself. In their opening statement, the defense told you that the defendant had taken bad drugs that day. But you can see it with your own eyes. The defendant isn't out of his mind on drugs. He's completely in control, and he's still trying to get what he wants. He wants Cassie back at that freak off. He doesn't want Officer Flores to see Jules. So when they get back to the room, the defendant tries to close the door such that Cassie would be shut inside that room. And Officer Flores doesn't see Jules. This is a man in control of himself. But it didn't work. Officer Flores stuck his foot in that door and it wouldn't close. Cassie just wanted to get her bag and phone and leave, so Officer Flores helps her do that. Officer Flores saw Jules just as Cassie left, and the defendant offered Flores that stack of cash as a attempted bribe. We talked about that. Cassie managed to get out of that hotel and back to her apartment, and look at the photo. This is her in the back of the car on her way back to her apartment, and she's covering her black eye with sunglasses, but you can see that swollen lip. And from there, the defendant enlists KK and D-Rock to help with damage control. We talked about that too. But of course, the defendant stayed focused on Cassie. He needed to keep her under control, and he was livid that she had disobeyed him and dared to call for help. He showed up at her apartment, banging on that door with a hammer, and even when she left, she couldn't get away. This incident should leave no doubt in your mind the defendant committed trafficking. When he chased Cassie, beat her, tried to drag her back to the hotel room where an escort was waiting, he was using force to cause Cassie to continue engaging in the freak-off, a commercial sex act. And at every step, he was in complete control of himself. Angry, but in control. He knew exactly what he is doing. That is sex trafficking. It doesn't matter that Officer Flores kept the freak off from continuing. It doesn't matter that Cassie managed to get away and avoid having sex with Jewel. The law does not require that a commercial sex act actually take place. What matters is that the defendant was knowingly using force and coercion to get Cassie back in that room where the escort was waiting. That is sex trafficking. Like they said in the opening statements, the defense may tell you the violence was not connected to the sex, but guess what? That's wrong too. The defendant was dragging her back to the hotel room where an escort was waiting so that they could finish a freak off the defendant wanted. Besides, sex trafficking statute doesn't require that force be used during the commercial sex act. And this is what happened when Cassie said no. You saw it in the video. She was hit in the face, thrown to the ground, kicked, and dragged back by the defendant.
Riley Herbst from 2311 Racing here. And you know what grinds my gears? Waiting for coffee. But instead of counting frappes and lattes, I fire up Chumba Casino. No apps, no fuss, just fun social casino games to pass the time. By the time my coffee's ready,
Order for Riley.
I've already taken a few victory laps. Next time you're stuck waiting, make it entertaining. Play for free at ChumbaCasino.com. Let's Chumba.
Sponsored by Chumba Casino. No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
Cassie couldn't forget this, and she didn't. Days later, she reminded the defendant. This was on March 10th, 5 days after the incident, that when you get fucked up the wrong way, you always want to show me you have the power and you knock me around. I'm not a rag doll. I am someone's child. The Intercontinental wasn't the only time the defendant was violent with Cassie during a freak-off. You heard about 2 more in Manhattan involving the escort Daniel Phillip, who testified during this trial. I'm going to focus on one of the 2 freak-offs. Again, the sex trafficking statute doesn't require force be used during a commercial sex act, but that's what you have in both of these situations. Between approximately 2012 and 2014, the defendant paid Daniel Phillip to have sex with Cassie during freak-offs in New York City, usually in hotels, but sometimes at Cassie's apartment. He testified each time that he had a freak-off with the defendant and Cassie, he was paid between $700 and $6,000. He was not paid for his time. I'm going to spend no more than 10 seconds on this ridiculous argument because you know why Daniel and all the other escorts were paid. They were paid for sex. So every time they had sex with Cassie in front of the defendant, that is a commercial sex act. At one of these freak-offs in Cassie's apartment, Daniel and Cassie were in the living room between sessions. The defendant told Cassie to come to him in the bedroom. Cassie was on her computer, and she told the defendant that she needed just a minute. The next thing that Daniel saw was a liquor bottle fly past Cassie's head and hit the wall. Then the defendant stormed out of the bedroom, grabbed Cassie by the hair, starts dragging her back by her hair into the bedroom, and Daniel heard what he said sounded like slapping and Cassie screaming, quote, I'm sorry. And the defendant at this point told her, bitch, when I tell you to come here, you come now, not later. The defendant said this to Cassie 4 years before the Intercontinental incident. He was training her to obey him. And when Cassie and the defendant came out of the bedroom, Daniel said that Cassie looked afraid, upset. He testified she didn't look like she wanted to continue the freak-off, but the defendant didn't care. He was ready for another session. The defendant told Daniel and Cassie, y'all ready to continue now? He meant that Daniel should start having sex with Cassie again. Members of the jury, there is no question about this. This is coercion. The force and the coercion worked in this instance. Cassie started to initiate the defendant's usual routine for every freak-off. She started touching Daniel, which usually led to rubbing with baby oil, and that usually led to sex. What the defendant couldn't control, though, was Daniel. He couldn't perform. The defendant cut the freak-off short, and again, it doesn't matter that the freak-off was cut short. The defendant knew what he was doing when he told Cassie and Daniel to continue. He was demanding that Cassie have sex with a paid escort, and that's sex trafficking. And there's one more example that I want to talk about. This one started when the defendant kicked Cassie off the boat in Cannes, France, and then threatened her on the flight back to New York. Now, it ended in a freak-off in New York. Cassie and the defendant, they were at Cannes, and you can see Cassie on the red carpet. She looked happy, radiant. The picture doesn't tell the full story, though. The night before, Cassie and the defendant got in a fight after the defendant accused her of stealing his drugs. He kicked her off the boat that they were staying on without anything, without even her shoes, without her passport. And Mia remembered that Cassie had injuries from that flight. And she also remembered Cassie had made an audio recording. Mia listened to that. She recognized both voices, Cassie's and Sean Combs. Cassie sounding panicked, and she remembered the defendant sounded very angry. She heard the sound of someone being hit in this recording. Cassie and the defendant still went to the movie premiere together, but in the theater, the defendant grabbed Cassie's leg, and he squeezed her beaded dress into her thigh as tightly as he could. And Mia remembered that too. She saw the defendant digging his nails into Cassie's arm at the premiere, clenching his teeth as he spoke to her. After the premiere, Cassie and the defendant flew back to New York City. Cassie didn't want to sit with the defendant, so she traded seats with someone else on a plane. He traded his own seat so he could sit next to her. And in case it wasn't totally clear to Cassie yet that the defendant had the power, he spent the entire flight holding her captive and making her watch videos he had recorded of the freak-offs. And the whole time, he was threatening to release them. Cassie told you how she felt. She said she couldn't have felt worse. She felt scared. She felt trapped. It's no surprise that when that plane landed in New York, the defendant demanded a freak-off and Cassie complied. She didn't believe she had a choice. He had just threatened her about blackmail tapes, some of the most humiliating moments of her life, and he had proven to her that he had them at his fingertips. They were on the laptop that he held on the plane. Those tapes would have done serious damage to Cassie's career, and they would have caused her huge personal harm. This is another example of clear-cut coercion. Remember, serious harm includes non-physical harm, including reputational harm. And here, the defendant has spent days making it so Cassie couldn't do anything about it but go along with what he wanted. He threw her off a boat in a foreign country without a passport. He threatened her physical safety inside a crowded movie theater. And then he played blackmail tapes of her on an airplane, threatening to release them. All of this was designed to do one thing, to make Cassie afraid to say no to him. These three examples are far from the only times that you know that Cassie was forced or coerced into a freak-off. You've heard weeks worth of testimony proving to you just how little control Cassie had. You should consider the full picture of the defendant's coercive scheme in looking at the freak-offs that you heard about. His violence, his threats, it was all intended to cause Cassie to believe at various points in their relationship that failure to perform freak-offs or do whatever else that defendant demanded would result in serious harm. The defendant created a climate of fear that can't be isolated to one moment in time. Dr. Hughes also told you about how this works. The abuse doesn't have to happen all the time for that link to be forged. Once someone has shown us not only the ability, but the willingness to use violence, your brain doesn't forget that. That's what Dr. Hughes said. Cassie repeatedly told you that the defendant's violence was in the back of her mind whenever he proposed a freak-off. The whole point was to control Cassie, to make her afraid to say no to the defendant, and it worked. Cassie told you she continued to engage in freak-offs with the defendant because she didn't feel like she had much of a choice. In her words, she said, "I didn't really know what no would be or what no could turn into." You knew what that meant. She was afraid of his violence. She said this repeatedly. She said she didn't want to make the defendant angry because when he was angry, he would be violent. When he was upset, the defendant would be a scary person and could be violent. She said if Sean wanted something to happen, that was what was going to happen. There wasn't another way around it. In their opening statement, the defense emphasized that Cassie made a choice every single day for years to stay with the defendant, that it was voluntary, adult choice. In other words, she could have said no to that relationship and she could have said no to the freak-offs. But let's step back. Imagine what it would be like to have the person closest to you hit you, throw you to the ground, kick you, drag you by your hair, all at seemingly random times for just saying the wrong thing, for not answering the phone quickly enough, for taking too long in the bathroom. Imagine this person is much bigger than you, stronger than you are, twice your age and your body size. Imagine the terror of not knowing what the next hit might be, not knowing what might set that person off. Now imagine trying to say no to that person, knowing the possibility of getting hit was constantly in the back of your mind. This was the force. So were the threats. This was all part of the coercion as well. During this trial, the defense has pointed to Cassie's text messages to say the defendant couldn't possibly have known that Cassie didn't want to participate in freak-offs, in part because of the text where Cassie seems excited for freak-offs or engages in explicit messages with the defendant. Your common sense tells you she didn't want to participate in those freak-offs. Cassie was clear in her testimony that there was one part of the freak-off she liked, and that was to get to spend time with the defendant. There was one person she wanted to have sex with at that time, her boyfriend, the defendant. You heard the exact same thing from Jane. So sending explicit messages to her boyfriend, that doesn't mean that Cassie wanted to have sex with escorts at freak-off. And it doesn't mean that her boyfriend didn't understand that she didn't want to. Cassie also engaged in explicit messages with the defendant because that's what he wanted her to do. All the way back in 2009, he said, quote, "You're supposed to be seducing me all day." He told her this throughout the relationship. There was a point where Cassie told the defendant she didn't want to do freak-offs. As a matter of fact, there were various points during their relationship, and she used her 29th birthday as an example of that. Cassie, Deontay, Brianna, they all testified about that night. After the defendant let her know that he wanted to freak off on her 29th birthday, Cassie told him she didn't want to do that. It was her birthday. She wanted to stay with her friends. She told her friends the same thing. She said the defendant had already let me know that he wanted to have a freak off, and I was like, okay, not right now. Like, I really wanted to celebrate my birthday. I told him that I wanted to stay out and celebrate with my friends. And remember, Deontay told you how Cassie said the defendant was angry because she did not want to go to the hotel and freak off with him. And what happened? Despite saying no, despite not wanting to do it, Cassie left her own birthday party with the defendant for a freak off. That right there is another clear-cut example of sex trafficking. The point was, if the defendant wanted a freak off, it was going to happen. You know why by now? It's because he didn't take no for an answer. You saw the video where the defendant was dragging Cassie back to the Intercontinental hotel room. Imagine living that. Going back to count one briefly, that's a pattern of racketeering activity that the defendant agreed to involve sex trafficking. Now, only the defendant was in the hotel rooms with Cassie and Jane and the escorts. But just like with everything else, he didn't do it alone. He needed help getting drugs for freak-offs, getting cash to pay the escorts, and he needed help keeping Cassie and Jane in line. For those things, he turned to his most loyal lieutenants, KK, D-Rock, and Fahim. Maybe they didn't like it. Maybe they weren't happy about it, but they helped him carry it out anyway, knowing full well what they were doing was wrong. Let's look at some of the examples of how members of the defendant's inner circle facilitated the defendant's sex trafficking. KK got strange men access to rooms that the defendant and his girlfriends were sharing at all hours of the night. Exhibit 1411 showed that one of the defendant's assistants seeking access for an entertainer named Clayton Howard. Remember, that's an escort the defendant and Cassie called Dave. Clayton Howard needed access to that hotel room. And KK saw what the defendant's girlfriends were doing in these hotel rooms. Remember, KK saw that video of Jane having sex with an escort that somehow wound up on an iPad of one of the staff. You heard Jonathan Perez.
Bubba Wallace here from 2311 Racing. Funny thing about being fast, you end up waiting a lot. First to show up, first in line, then just waiting. Me, I rev up Chumba Casino. With over 200 social casino games, no slow lanes here. Why sit around when you can spin? I'm already racing. Your turn. Play for free at ChumbaCasino.com. Let's Chumba.
Sponsored by Chumba Casino. No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.
One of the assistants testified about that. So she knew about the freak-offs and the Wild King Nights, as she called them. She knew they involved the defendant's girlfriends having sex with escorts. KK knew that what was happening in these videos was wrong, but she did damage control. As a matter of fact, she interrogated Jonathan Perez about it. And you know who else knew about that video? Jonathan Perez saw? Fahim. He mentioned it to Jonathan Perez later. Of course Fahim knew. He was the inner circle. He was part of the need to know. And for the rest of this prosecutor's closing statement, I'm just going to summarize it because if I read this word for word, we'd be going another 2 hours. But I will summarize it where you're going to get the gist of this thing. So Slavik then addresses the forced labor as an element of the racketeering conspiracy charge. And the prosecutor said the jury heard evidence of forced labor as to Cassie Ventura, Jane, Mia, and Capricorn Clark. And she said Diddy forced Ventura and Jane into grueling days of long sexual encounters without sleep, and that qualifies as forced labor. She said Combs forced them to both have sex, multiple men, multiple times over multiple days. They got sores, they got sick, they got infections. Both women testified they regularly got UTI infections from the freak-offs, and it got to a point where antibiotics were ineffective. She said Jane and Cassie both testified they would endure a freak-off while they still had a UTI from a previous sexual encounter. And she said that when they told Combs they were tired or sick, he told them to keep going and, quote, finish strong. Slavik said Mia is also a victim of forced labor. Quote, the defendant treated Mia differently than many of the other personal assistants, and he demanded more and abused her more. Mia was also required to provide sexual services to the defendant. Quote, he sexually assaulted Mia when Cassie and his other girlfriends were not around. She listed several sexual assaults that Mia testified about, including a time he forced her to perform oral sex on him. As Mia's boss, Combs had all the power and control over her. So even though she never wanted to have sex with him, he knew that she couldn't say no and that she wouldn't say no. Quote, these sexual assaults were the most traumatic things that ever happened to her, so much so she planned to die with that secret. Combs was also violent with Mia when she didn't do exactly what she wanted, including by throwing things at her and slamming her arm into a door, Slavik said. She also witnessed Combs being violent with Cassie. Quote, Mia saw and experienced extreme violence at her boss's hands. It's no wonder she was always worried about her physical safety if she was to tell him no. After Combs was violent, he would enlist HR and other employees to punish Mia. He would often threaten her job, which was her entire world at that time. She said Mia felt she couldn't go to law enforcement because she had seen Combs was above the police. And Slavik addressed some of the loving messages and posts that Mia wrote to and about Combs, and she said that Mia testified sometimes the defendant treated her like his best friend, and other times he treated her like she was worthless. Quote, the highs and lows that Mia described were a cycle of abuse that created a trauma bond. In the moment, Mia couldn't see it for what it was. Slavik said Combs' former employee, Capricorn Clark, was also a victim of forced labor. She worked for Combs on and off from 2004 to 2012 in different jobs, enduring frequent threats to herself and her job, and he used force against her. Slavik said Human Resources was a puppet for Combs and didn't advocate for Clark or other employees. When Clark tallied $80,000 in overtime pay that she was owed, Combs ripped up the paper and never paid her, Slavik said. Human Resources didn't do anything about it. The defense may argue that Clark was not forced to work because she continued to come back to Combs for years after 2012, but that doesn't erase the forced labor. Clark went back to him for jobs because he made sure she couldn't get a job unless it was with him in the industry. Combs told her she would never work again and made sure that that was true. Slavik said Sean Combs engaged in witness tampering and obstruction after Cassie Ventura's lawsuit was filed in 2023. For years, the defendant took great pains to keep his criminal conduct from being exposed, but many of the crimes that we've been speaking about were made public when Cassie filed her lawsuit. Combs knew the allegations in the civil lawsuits could lead to a criminal investigation, so he turned to his inner circle to help him, quote, neutralize the people who could damage him the most. Slavik went on to say paying people off with $100,000 in a paper bag wasn't an option. He needed to stay under the radar. She reminded the jury about 2 calls between Combs and Jane that were recovered from KK's phone. She said the calls occurred shortly after the lawsuit was settled, and she said the only reason the defendant is doing that, reaching out to Jane, is fear of a criminal investigation. The defendant tries to feed Jane the false narrative of the events of the past 3 years, Slavik said. What he says to her, he knows isn't true. It's what he wants her to say to protect him. That's witness tampering. That's obstruction. Slavik said Combs tried repeatedly to get Jane to say she was a willing participant in those hotel nights, but Jane wouldn't, and when she pushed back, Combs cut her off. Slavik pointed out that you can hear the scratching of a Sharpie writing on paper in the background of one recording. She said Coram was present, but couldn't speak because that would reveal the presence to Jane, so they were writing notes to each other, and they were working together as a team. Later in that call, Combs dangled a carrot by telling Jane she wouldn't have to worry about anything as long as she was on his side. 2 days later, he instructed Coram to make sure the rent was still being paid on time. Slavik said Coram made sure it was done because she knew what a threat Jane could be to the defendant. She helped Combs cover up the crime and then record these calls with Jane to fabricate evidence. Slavik said Diddy's attempts to convince Mia to lie or give false information to law enforcement in 2023 and 2024 are also examples of witness tampering and obstruction. She listed some of the key witnesses who testified at the trial. She recounted all of their messages, recordings, and images that the jury saw, saying, quote, "All of this evidence paints a clear picture of how the defendant committed crime after crime for 2 decades, how he didn't take no for an answer. The evidence shows you how he and his inner circle committed the crimes and how far they would go to cover them up." And she ended it with, "Up until today, Combs was able to get away with these crimes due to his money, his power, and his influence. That stops today. It's time to hold him accountable." And with that, the prosecution rested. And all we got left is the defense. Thank you so much for listening. I know this was a long one today. My voice is about out. Have a great weekend. And until next time, I'm Jim Chapman with Exposed Scandalous Files of the Elite. Much love.
Breaking news from the stadium tonight as an anonymous fan foot the bill for 55,000 hot dogs, bringing that sweet tubed meat to everyone in attendance.
Free dogs! Yeah!
55,000 hot dogs? What does that even cost? While the identity of this Frankfurter philanthropist remains anonymous, their all-beefy generosity will go down in history.
The new Mega Millions. More to win means more to give. How you spend it is up to you.
Yeah!
For game odds and details, visit sceducationlottery.com.
Step into the world of power, loyalty, and luck.
I'm gonna make him an offer he can't refuse.
With family, cannolis, and spins mean everything.
Now, you wanna get mixed up in the family business.
Introducing The Godfather at ChumbaCasino.com. Test your luck in the shadowy world of The Godfather slot.
Someday, I will call upon you to do a service for me.
Play The Godfather now at ChumbaCasino.com.
Welcome to the family.